Today's essential question is, what does the First Amendment have to say about religion, government, and the people? So, as always, when we work through our essential questions, I always like to provide you some guideposts, right? Or some headings that are going to be really helpful for you in organizing your notes and your thinking about this topic. And I have bullet pointed those headings below here on the slide. In addition, I am going to encourage you to find that pocket constitution that I have distributed to you. Now, if you don't have your Pocket Constitution handy, you can always download the Constitution app on your phone for free. It comes in handy from time to time. In addition, you can always look up the Constitution online. It is in a myriad of places. So let's start by talking about the First Amendment. So I want to work on this very first bullet point, and it would be handy if you had a copy of the First Amendment in front of you and with your pocket constitution. So if you look at the First Amendment, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, semicolon. That's like one big concept, right? That's what the semicolon establishes. It says, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, semicolon, another big concept. Or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So if you have examined that brief video from the National Constitution Center, it really tells you that the First Amendment highlights 5 freedoms: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition, right? Those are the 5 freedoms that we see in the First Amendment. Oftentimes, when we're examining the First Amendment in class, I'll have students underline each of those freedoms so that they can begin to see them kind of grouped as they are. What I intend to do as we examine the First Amendment is really to dig in a little bit on each part of the First Amendment, or what we call clauses, right? A clause, a component of the First Amendment. And so today, what I want to focus a little bit more on is what's called the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So, as always, when talking about the Constitution, I always like to have us look at the background. So, my second bullet point is the background of the Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause. So, let's talk about the ideas behind these. And if you're not understanding what even like the Establishment Clause means or free exercise, establishment means prohibiting the government from establishing their own religion, right? That's what it means, prohibiting the government from establishing or creating its own religion. And the Free Exercise Clause relates to your ability to exercise or to participate in a religion of your choosing as you see fit without the government putting limitations on it. So, where do we see the background of these concepts or these clauses? The ideas behind these kind of come from these ideas that emerge in early America. All but 4 colonies had established preferred faiths, and some colonies just outright discriminated against certain faiths. So, for example, in Maryland, which initially began as a Catholic colony, eventually, after the Act of Toleration, they allowed Protestants to worship, but would not allow anybody who was non-religious to live in the colony, and it was punishable by death. So not every colony is necessarily tolerant or even accepting of other religions. And that's just, Maryland is just one example, to be fair, but recognize all but 4 of the colonies had a preferred religion. At the time of the American Revolution and thereafter, there were instances of Virginia actually taxing its citizens to pay for a church. So they would put on local community taxes and even state taxes in order to actually fund church activities. And while you might go, okay, well, yeah, because that church is important. But imagine, if you would, that you weren't a member of that church and didn't subscribe to a specific faith, yet you were compelled or obligated to pay taxes. So one of these sort of early questions that kind of emerges in early America is, can a citizen be required to give his or her tax money to support a particular faith? And it is also Jefferson who has some additional concerns. He really wanted to balance religious fervor to loyalty to the nation. And every now and then we see this kind of emerge again. This, question, and I'm not saying it's a legitimate question, but we do hear this question emerge from time to time: is, can a person be both? Can they be loyal to a country and be loyal to their faith? And I think that's an individual question. I'm sure many of us in this room would go, yep, I don't see an issue with that at all. But recognize that, like in the 1960 election, that emerged with Kennedy. There were folks asking, can Kennedy be a loyal religious man and at the same time, or I should say loyal to his faith, at the same time be putting his country first? And so I think those are just interesting questions without necessarily good answers or complete answers. But it's something Jefferson thought about, and we know that from his writing. So let's talk a little bit about my third bullet point, and that is, what does the court have to say about the Establishment Clause? So here's what the Supreme Court has said, because we've previously identified that it is up to the judicial branch to determine limitations. So I want to talk about the Establishment Clause first and what the court says. The court says that it prohibits government from sanctioning a church, meaning supporting a church. So the government cannot support one faith or one church over any others. The Supreme Court has said that the government cannot force or influence a person to go to church. The court has ruled that you can't punish someone for their religious beliefs. The court has ruled that the government cannot prefer one religion over another. The court has ruled that the government can't tax religious organizations and religious activities. Now, I'm going to push pause on this one because it's an interesting question. What is a religious activity versus what is a political activity? So if a church decides that on Sunday during their sermon that they want to talk about a political candidate, and they want to talk about all the ways in which Tom Hanks would make an excellent president, and the church wants to discuss how the members of the church should be giving money to Tom Hanks's presidential campaign, then the church has shifted away from religious activities and has now moved into the realm of the political, which means that the church is and can be open to being taxed because it has shifted away from a religious organization into a political organization. So I always like to highlight that point, that if a church is engaging purely in religious activities, not an issue, can't be taxed. Once it moves into a political realm, it can be. And then lastly, government can't participate in the affairs of religious organizations. So religious organizations are free to operate as they choose to without the United States government engaging heavily. Now, there's this really fine line in this, and I think it's a good question, and that has to do with what happens when religious organizations choose to violate federal law. And I think that's just a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. You're going to hear me say that a lot as we deal with liberties and rights. They're great questions. I'm not in the position of answering those, right? That's up to the court. But here's an example. If we have a law in the United States about undocumented immigrants, and let's say that a person who's committed a crime, who is an undocumented immigrant, is being harbored safely by a church. Can the federal government go into that church to grab the person? And that's a good question. And that's all I can tell you is it's a good question. I don't know. What if a church decides to use their facility as a place to engage in illegal activities? There's this new series on TV, I think on Netflix right now, called Waco, right? And that is about a church, the Branch Dravidians. They firmly believed in their faith. So, I mean, these are good questions. Again, I don't know the answers to them. I don't pretend to be in the position of those 9 justices in the US Supreme Court. But those are the types of things I want you to think about. So how do we deal with all of this about these questions about establishment and what is a church and what isn't a church? Well, I can tell you this, that the Supreme Court is loath, that means they don't like, to define what is a church and what isn't a church. They don't want to get into that world because they don't want to be in the decision making of what's a religion and what's not a religion, what quantifies as a faith and what's not a faith. And quite frankly, I might often say on a tangent, maybe you don't want your government to engage in what's a faith and what's not a faith. Like maybe, if we think about this wall of separation or the separation of church and state, maybe it's best that government doesn't dictate what a faith is and what isn't a faith. Because that could be a slippery slope, right? And liberty is truly liberty when you have the opportunity to engage in it as you want to. That's certainly what John Locke, who we talked about at the very beginning of this course, believed in. So the court is really, really careful about how they deal with Establishment Clause cases. It's something that they are very attentive to and that they work really hard whenever they see a case come up to them. They oftentimes will pick an Establishment Clause case because they'd like to create clarity on the issue. I'll just kind of wrap up here quickly and say there was a case that went to the court last year. It's about a gigantic cross. And the cross was erected in 1920, 1921 as a memorial to fallen soldiers in World War I. It was just outside of Baltimore, Maryland. And the city had been using taxpayer dollars to pay for the upkeep of the cross. And so, the cross as a religious symbol is oftentimes associated with Christianity. And so there was this question about, can the city actually use tax dollars to pay for the upkeep of this memorial? And when the court heard this case last year, they really had to dig into okay, do people perceive this as a religious memorial? Do they associate it purely with religion and not with religion? What was the intent of the people when they built the memorial in 1920? And that's the kind of work that the court has to do. They don't want to engage in, is a cross a sign of Christianity? That question's already been answered. Instead, they have to decide, okay, is this a memorial, a religious memorial, or not a religious memorial? Because if it's not a religious memorial, then it's totally okay for taxpayer dollars to go to pay for the upkeep of this thing. But if it is, then we have to ask some questions. So I'm going to leave you on that. Your next step is you've got some scenarios you're going to work with and start really thinking about those limitations, about what the court has says is okay and isn't okay. And if you have any questions, let me know.